A young girl makes an unexpected social call when she finds a mysterious passageway in the town cemetery. Laura Lee lived in Berwyn Creek, a place that wasn't anything special. What's special, though, is how she ended up 6 feet underground in the Berwyn Creek Cemetery. Now, I know what you're thinking, but don't worry, she didn't die, not yet anyway. She was alive the whole time. There she was, a 7-year-old girl, down there with the dead, and she lived to tell the story. She told it to me, and now I'm going to tell it to you, but only if I can trust you won't make a big deal out of it. It's a great story, but we don't want people from outside coming here and thinking we're all crazy, right? So here's how it went. Little Laura Lee was 7 years old when all this happened. She lived with her father and brother in a small 2-bedroom house on Tully Street. But it wasn't easy for her. She was the only girl in the family. Her mother had passed away when Laura Lee was just a year old, and back then they didn't live in Berwyn Creek. They were in Song Lake or Coopersville, or somewhere like that. Anyway, after her mother died, her father had to work a lot, so they moved to Berwyn Creek. This way, her grandmother Laura Lee's father's mom could help take care of the kids while their dad worked and was away from home. They moved into her grandmother's house on Tully Street, and the 2 kids got their own room. The grandmother had her own room, and their father slept on the couch in the living room. They lived like this for about 4 years, and little Laura Lee loved her grandmother so much. Her name was Judith, but everyone called her Grandma Judy. She was a short, chubby lady who always wore a plain dress with an apron. Everyone on Tully Street knew her, and you'd often see her outside talking to people. She always wore a plain dress and a red kerchief tied over her curly gray hair when she was outside, and her front door was always open. Grandma Judy always forgot to close it after she went out to visit someone. As I said, Laura Lee was the only girl in the family at the time all this happened, and that was because Grandma Judy died when Laura Lee was about 5 years old. It broke that poor girl's heart, but there was nothing she could do. She just kept going. It wasn't all bad timing, though, because by then Laura Lee was old enough for kindergarten, and her brother Pete was 2 years older, so Grandma Judy didn't need to watch the kids during the day anymore. But it was still very sad when she passed away, and poor little Laura Lee was heartbroken. They stayed in Grandma's house, and her father took Grandma Judy's room, but the house always felt so empty. Laura Lee started going to school, and she did okay, but it was kind of hard. Pete was a bit of a tease, like boys can be, and he didn't always treat her very nicely at school. She had a hard time, especially since she hardly ever saw her father and her dear grandma was gone. She didn't have anyone to help her with her homework, and she thought math was really hard to figure out on her own. She often felt very alone. Laura Lee made some friends with girls her age, and they were okay, but some of them weren't always nice to her, so it was like an up and down friendship. Bethany, who was a couple of years older and lived on Garfield Street, was a bit of a know-it-all. She always had the best clothes and toys, and she wanted everyone else to know it. All the girls looked up to her for being so grown up too. Ruth Ann was usually nicer than Bethany, but she wanted Bethany to like her so much that whenever Bethany was around, she almost became a completely different person. Rebecca was the same. They just wanted Bethany's attention and to be liked by her, so they went along with whatever she said or did. You know how those kinds of people are, and it's really sad. Then there were the twin sisters, Nancy and Brenda. They were so shy and quiet that whenever Laura Lee talked to them, she felt like she had to do all the talking for all 3 of them. But they were nice, and sometimes they let Laura Lee come over to their house after school for a snack and some playtime. In fact, it was while Laura Lee was coming home from Nancy and Brenda's that this whole thing happened. You see, whenever Laura Lee was going home from school or from Nancy and Brenda's house, she could take the long way around, or she could cut through the Berwyn Creek Cemetery. Usually she went through the cemetery. The cemetery could be a sad and even scary place if someone was alone or walking in the dark, but Laura Lee almost never went through it when it was dark, even though she did usually go through it alone. But even though it was a little gloomy, Laura Lee loved passing by Grandma Judy's grave and remembering the dear old lady's happy laugh and wrinkled smile. She missed Grandma Judy, even though a couple of years had passed since she died. Well, on this particular day, it was about 5 o'clock in the evening, and since it was November, the shadows were long, and the sun was almost gone. Laura Lee was coming home from seeing Nancy and Brenda, who had been in a quiet mood. Even though she was with friends, the visit left Laura Lee feeling very lonely, and she was sad as she walked home. It's funny, isn't it, how we can sometimes be around people and still feel alone. Laura Lee turned off Plymouth Street and went into the cemetery, like she usually did. Near an old oak tree, There was a tall headstone with a cross on top that she always used as a landmark to help guide her to Grandma Judy's grave. She walked towards it, bending under and around tree branches and dodging tombstones along the way. Sometimes, she looked at the other headstones as she passed. She thought Edith Balmwood had a beautiful stone, and she often wondered why Nathan Pershing had died so young, and why Rusty McMaster had a gravestone that said, "Until later, old rascal." A gust of golden leaves blew past as Laura Lee approached and passed the tall stone with the cross. From there, it was just a few more steps to reach her destination. She arrived at Grandma Judy's grave, but things were not what she expected. Do you know what she saw? I bet you can't guess. There was Grandma Judy's grave, just like it had always been. But right next to it, as clear as day, was a hole. That's right. There was a big, rectangular hole in the ground beside Grandma Judy's grave, and not only that, there were steps carved into the dirt, leading down into the hole. Well, Laura Lee was shocked. That hole had never been there before. She had walked past just the day before, and there had been no hole. It could have been another grave, except for the strange steps going down into it. Laura Lee stepped closer to the hole and saw that there was an arched passageway leading from the hole into the ground. She was confused. And who wouldn't be? What was this hole doing here? And where did that passageway lead? Laura Lee looked around to see if anyone else was nearby. Had anyone else seen the hole? Was it made by the cemetery workers? She saw no one. Just the rays of the disappearing sunlight shining through the trees and gently lighting the tombstones. A bird chirped now and then. But there was nobody around. Now, Laura Lee was wondering whether she should explore the hole or just walk away. She stood there for a moment, thinking about what to do. What if someone saw her? What if it was dangerous? But the curiosity was too much. The hole and the steps seemed to call out to her. Laura Lee glanced back at the hole, then at Grandma Judy's headstone. It had a beautiful flower pattern around the edges. Laura Lee remembered standing there at the graveside service just a couple of years ago. She immediately wished she hadn't thought about that, because just like a crack in a dam, the memory brought back many little leaks of thoughts about Grandma Judy, playing with toys, being pushed on the playground swings by Grandma Judy, baking bread and cookies together, reading books, and talking about monsters under the bed, laughing about how they probably weren't real, and if they were probably just as scared as Laura Lee. Oh, how she missed Grandma Judy. She loved her more than anyone else in the world, and it still hurt so much that she was gone. Laura Lee blinked back tears and wiped a few off her cheek. That was such a hard separation for the poor girl. Suddenly, Laura Lee gasped and looked up, a terrible thought coming to her. What if someone had done something to Grandma Judy under the ground? The passageway in the hole. It was right next to Grandma Judy's grave.